Christians. In a post where I was asked the question, what is the definition of a Christian? I simply explained that the definition of a Christian is someone who is a disciple of Christ, someone who follows Christ. But also, I want to add to that, it is someone who follows Christ knowing that he is the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah. So to be a believer in Jesus Christ, you must acknowledge that he is the promised Messiah or the promised Christ that the old covenant prophets foretold about. In response to that post, this gentleman here tells me that my explanation is definitely not true. And it is. He goes on to say that outsiders called believers in Christ were called Christians. And he's right about that. But when you say outsiders, sir, you need to make sure that you clarify what an outsider was. An outsider at that time was someone who accepted Christ as the Christ, contrary to the Jews who refused to acknowledge him as their promised Messiah. So all Christians are outsiders from those who reject Christ as the Messiah. So you are right, just with the wrong argument to support it. Now, you say today, any and everyone uses the title Christian. A lot of people use that. A lot of people use that. A lot of people lie. They usurp the term Christian to try to get credibility to their own falsehood and lies. And we would refer to them as antichrist. And also, the fact that the Bible, especially John, the fact that he uses the term antichrist throughout his epistles is also evidence that the Christian is an apropos name for those who follow Christ, because he acknowledges that there are antichrists and that there is an antichrist. So these would be anti-Christian folks who would usurp the name of Christ when they have abandoned belief in all those things that Christ taught. So while I realize and I can be grateful that you think that this is some kind of a profound statement, it is not. The Bible only uses the term Christian 3 times. In one time, we see it in Acts chapter 26, verse 28, and I'll read it. Paul had been preaching in front of Agrippa, and Agrippa was someone who was well known with the way or Christianity. And he said to Paul, when Paul was preaching, he says, almost, do you persuade me to become a Christian? So Agrippa is acknowledging not only that Paul is trying to persuade him to be a Christian, he is also acknowledging that that is Paul's purpose and that it is something that Paul did not regard lightly, but esteemed highly. He acknowledged Paul to be a Christian, and Paul did not argue against that. Agrippa knew that Paul was trying to persuade him to become what he was, which was and is a Christian. Now, in Acts chapter 11, it says the following in verse 26. And when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch, and it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. And the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. The disciples were called Christians. So that means that the disciples of Christ are those who are called Christians. And it is not a derogatory term, as some suppose, And in terms of Christians calling themselves Christians, but it was derogatory from those who were opposed to Christianity, who called Christians Christians, because they wanted to make sure that, the God you worship is not our God. The Messiah that you worship is not the Messiah that we are still waiting for. The Messiah that you accept is the Messiah that we reject. So Christians were first called Christians at Antioch. And it says that they were first called Christians there, meaning that it didn't stop at Antioch. And not only did it not stop in Antioch, it continues over 2,000 years later, where Christians are still called Christians, and proudly so. So you say definitely not, that my explanation was wrong, was not correct. You are wrong, sir. It is definitely correct. And you, like so many other people, don't know what you're talking about. Lastly, I want to point out the third place where Christians are referred to in the Bible. And that is in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16, which Peter says this, and this sums it all up better than anything that anybody can say. In a few short lines, Peter says, "Yet, if any man suffers as a Christian," listen to what he says. If any man suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. And then he goes on to say, but let him glorify God on his behalf. On whose behalf? On the behalf of Christ. Peter says, if any man suffers as a Christian, meaning that there are those who do suffer as a Christian. And the fact of the matter is, every man who is a Christian will suffer. And Peter goes on to say that if you do not be ashamed. Ashamed of what? Of your condition or your position as a Christian. Do not be ashamed of it. If you suffer as a Christian, you suffer for Christ. Do not be ashamed of it. Christians, do not be ashamed of being called a Christian and being a Christian, and they need to be the same. If you're going to be called a Christian, then be one. Not only does Peter say not to be ashamed, but he says, but glorify God on his behalf. Be glad that you are able to suffer as a Christian, and it's so that you glorify God on behalf of Christ. There's nothing else for me to say. If there are mic drop moments anywhere in this life, this is one. Peter drops the mic when he says, if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on his behalf. That is a mic drop. Be provoked and be persuaded.